This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Several weeks ago on this show, we discussed why Minneapolis never gobbled up its suburbs. Today, we are tackling another important question about how the Twin Cities region is organized. Reader Scott Berger wanted to know why Minneapolis and St. Paul never merged. We're chatting today with the Star Tribune's Kevin Duchschere, who wrote a story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. But first, here's Scott.
So I wrote to the Star Tribune, Curious Minnesota, about the question of why Minneapolis and St. Paul are and have been separate cities. I'm a resident of St. Paul, and I'm familiar with budget issues and a number of other issues that I think could be shared between the cities. And I've noticed, looking around the nation, if you go by largest cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul typically don't come to the top of the list, and yet the metro area is significant. There are benefits of being combined. There can be efficiencies and cost savings. And I know for a fact, because I used to live in Fairfax County, Virginia, that there is a county and a city that are one and the same. And I think the basis behind that is to save on administration and other things. And so between taxing and services and frankly just metro pride and being on lists as a larger city, that's what inspired my question of why Minneapolis and St. Paul never merged and why couldn't they merge in the future.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today. So I feel like we kind of have a chip on our shoulder around here, like we are a big deal. We know we're a big deal.
Yeah, we are.
But we kind of, if we look at the lists and the rankings, and we shouldn't be judging ourselves by lists and rankings, but we just don't make it high enough on these things. Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're not as high. We don't get even on a lot of lists because we're not in the top 20, 30, 40 biggest cities in the country. So it's, where are we in the national scheme of things?
It's perplexing, Eric. Minneapolis ranks in the 40s in terms of population among cities in this country, and St. Paul is farther down in the 60s.
Okay.
So they've got us there with the likes of Newark and Oakland.
Okay. And what if we had put them together?
And if we put them together, we would be number 19. We'd be the 19th most populous city in the United States between Seattle and Denver, which is where, of course, we want to be.
Well, those are the peer cities we compare ourselves to. And when you looked into this history, you really found that the merger was a real live issue for a large part of these two cities' history, right? This is not some fringe topic.
No, actually, the issue caught fire in the late 1800s and early 1900s when there was a good deal of assumption in the Twin Cities and around the country that eventually, of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul would merge.
Okay.
They were growing towards each other geographically. St. Paul was expanding westward. Eventually, of course, their borders would meet. And in the center of all that was an area that they thought would be the center of this great new metropolis.
Okay. And just you have a quote here high up in the story noting that the Minneapolis Tribune, this newspaper back in 1891, which is skipping ahead a couple years, but they said that the merger is simply manifest destiny. So that really puts a fine point on how it seems like we were really on the precipice of something there. Okay, so where does this story begin? I guess we're got to go back to the 1880s, or when do these discussions start to happen around a possible merger?
Well, originally we're talking about three cities on the river: Minneapolis, St. Paul, and St. Anthony.
Okay.
And St. Paul was far and away the lead city of those three. It was the state capital. It was the head of commerce on the Mississippi River. But then in 1874, Minneapolis and St. Anthony, which were across the river from each other, merged.
Okay.
And that put Minneapolis into the running with St. Paul in terms of population and influence and power.
And tell us a little bit about, just before we get into the chronology here, the background of these cities, because St. Paul's an older city than Minneapolis, and Minneapolis has some different demographics.
St. Paul was founded in about 1841. It was a river city. It had a navigation, as I said, on the river, and it specialized in trade and river commerce. Minneapolis really didn't get started until the late 1860s, but Minneapolis had one great advantage that St. Paul did not have. It had the only significant waterfall on the Mississippi River, St. Anthony Falls. Mm-hmm. And what that meant was that Minneapolis could take its place as a leader in lumber milling and, of course, eventually flour milling.
Okay.
And that in the end, that eventually would put Minneapolis ahead of St. Paul in terms of commerce and so forth.
Okay. So there's some discussions, as you say, starting around the 1880s, Minneapolis is coming up as a flour milling capital, but there's discussions of what? Is it explicitly about a merger or what's happening?
Well, there was an assumption, really, that eventually the two cities would merge, because why wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
You would have that much influence and power. You could take your place among the leading cities in the United States. And, of course, the people in both cities thought that they deserved to be there on that list. And for that reason, property was getting snapped up in the Midway district of St. Paul, because that was sort of the center of both cities.
Mm-hmm.
And people envisioned the brand new state capital going there. Archbishop John Ireland thought it would be a wonderful place for the cathedral that he was planning to build.
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, too, there was a lot of speculation about the land in the Midway. A lot of people were buying up property for that matter.
I think it's funny there's so much focus here about Midway. And for those folks who aren't familiar with the geography, I mean, Midway is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically the middle point between the two cities, but it is in St. Paul, right? And today, this is sort of an industrial area for the most part. There's a very large freight rail yard there. There's Highway 280. There's plenty of great things in the Midway, but we don't think about it as like the core of the Twin Cities, right? As they were maybe saying at the time.
It doesn't sound to me, Eric, like you're much charmed by the Midway.
Hey, look, I love industrial things. I'm just saying this is an industrial area, right? I mean, that's kind of what it's known for.
That's what it is today, right. But back then, they had great visions of it being sort of the centerpiece.
Right, with a capital and a cathedral.
Right,
and
exactly.
It's just hard to imagine today based on how we know the Midway. So, okay, sounds like we're making some great momentum here toward the inevitable manifest destiny joining of these cities. Nothing could stop that kind of progress toward a merger, could it?
Oh, but you're wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, then comes the Great Census War of 1890.
Oh, okay. And this is a Cold War, I presume?
There's a Cold War. No weapons involved.
No violence.
Although police got involved in the picture eventually.
Okay.
What this was all about was in 1880, after Minneapolis merged with St. Anthony, it actually pulled slightly ahead of St. Paul in terms of population. They were both still very close.
Mm-hmm.
So 1890 was going to be the great showdown between the two cities to find out which of the two really was the most important and the biggest city in the state of Minnesota.
Right.
And what this did was it kicked off what we call today the Census War of 1890. Of course, every 10 years, the federal government takes a census of the whole country. And both cities connived to try to pad the books and find as many residents within their boundaries as they could, even if they had to make up a few of them.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So what happened was, and both cities were aware and very suspicious of what the other city was doing. St. Paul sent a spy to spend some time among the folks in Minneapolis that were counting residents, and discovered that, in fact, whole families were being concocted out of thin air in Minneapolis.
Right.
He brought evidence of this back to St. Paul. When the Minneapolis people went over to collect the evidence, St. Paul police officers showed up, pulled their guns, and said, "Why don't you just go on your way?" And eventually what happened was the federal government, it was serious enough that the federal government decided that it needed to investigate and find out what happened here. And the result was that they had to expunge about 18,000 names from Minneapolis's rolls, about 9,000 names from St. Paul's rolls. But in the end, the Mill City won out. The final count put it at nearly 165,000 residents compared to 133,000 in St. Paul.
Oh, okay.
And Minneapolis has never looked back, and it still holds a significant lead over St. Paul to this day.
So that was when it really became the larger of the two cities like we know it now. So, okay, this was a lot of bad blood between two cities at that time. But in the wings, there's still chatter about this merger even into the 1890s. Who's still bringing this up in the 1890s?
Well, the thing is, on paper anyway, it looked like it made a good deal of sense, especially to people outside Minnesota who looked at it and thought, well, it's inevitable. These two cities are so close together, they're eventually going to get together. In 1891, somebody published anonymously a pamphlet in which they talked about the two cities becoming, quote unquote, federal city.
Okay.
With a population of 900,000, mayors alternating from both sides of the river, and it captured the imagination of a lot of the local Twin Cities newspapers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The St. Paul Chamber thought about the fact that perhaps it had lost a step since the railroads were taking over some of the commerce from the river, and decided to vote a committee to look into a merger and invited the Minneapolis Board of Trade to do the same. So
Okay.
St. Paul went to Minneapolis hat in hand and sort of swallowed and said, maybe we ought to think about this.
Right. And so was Minneapolis interested in this?
Not at all.
Okay.
A month later, the St. Paul Chamber had to wait for their answer for a month. And they finally heard from the Minneapolis Board.
They're waiting by the telegram
Sure,
or the
exactly.
or the
Yeah.
mail. I don't know.
Yeah, in fact, the Mill City business people said that the only reason St. Paul wanted to merge was to boost the land values in the Midway district, and there might have been some truth in that.
Mm-hmm.
But the Minneapolis board member, J.T. Wyman, was quoted in the newspaper, quote, "We don't want union with St. Paul. We don't want to even consider the matter. We are stronger and better off without St. Paul."
Oh, wow. So
pretty
that's,
strong.
pretty strong words there. It's sort of interesting. This is all coming from the business tycoons of the day,
That's
not
right.
like the mayors or anything, but it kind of maybe shows you that industry's kind of not running the show, but certainly a huge influence over the
Yeah.
two cities. All right. So then, you mentioned John Ireland thinking about a cathedral in the Midway, and they were going to rebuild the Capitol, and maybe somebody said we should go Midway. I mean, what happens to all this stuff?
I mean, it was pretty clear at that point that it probably was not going to happen. In fact, newspapers around the country, one said there will be no more gibberish about Mini Paul or Paulopolis. And that was one of the fun things about this story, was to discover the names of the United City that were being discussed. Archbishop of Ireland wanted to call it Paulopolis. Minneapolis got a lot of votes as well.
None of these seem like, I don't know. If you're asking my opinion.
You don't like the city? Okay.
I don't know. It's okay. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Minneapolis.
That's right. Yeah.
Minneapolis is also, I guess, a mouthful by the same metric.
Anyway, in 1893, the legislature decided to keep the state capitol in downtown St. Paul. That sort of put an end to the Midway land rush, and eventually Archbishop Ireland found a nice hill near downtown St. Paul in which to build his cathedral, and the rest is history.
Okay. So we found in here in our archives an interesting note from 1895. There's like a whole page where the Minneapolis Tribune polled newspaper editors around the country. And it's kind of interesting because you kind of get this perspective from all these cities around the country about how they view these two cities here in Minnesota and what they think about whether there should be a merger. The whole poll was sort of about being a merger, more of a survey than a poll, I guess. What kind of came out of that? I mean, what was sort of interesting from some of those comments?
Well, again, if you didn't live in Minnesota or the Twin Cities, you could see no good reason why the two cities shouldn't merge. As a matter of fact, there was a good deal of talk in Minnesota about the cities being a rival to Chicago in terms of its influence in the Midwest. And there was, in fact, the editor of the Chicago Times-Herald visited the city. He said he rode between the two cities on the electric line, noted the wonderful filling up with buildings of what a few years ago was farmlands. He was talking about the Midway area.
Right.
Every new improvement brings you closer. So a lot of people just assumed, well, this was going to happen sooner or later, because it made a lot of sense. In 1906, the head of the Chicago Great Western Railroad, A.B. Stickney, came to town and addressed a crowd in St. Paul and said, what are you guys thinking? A merged city would make you a world commercial power. And he pointed to New York and London as examples of cities that had sort of expanded and merged and become powerful through consolidation. So
because he said we would be the sixth largest city in the country?
Right. That's right.
Okay. And there's a great political cartoon on the story by a guy named Charles Bartholomew who depicted Stickney. He's trying to get Minnie and Paul, which are human depictions of these two cities. Minnie is a woman in one corner and Paul is a man in another corner, trying to get them to meet on this sort of like love seat or something in the middle. Or what is that? That's kind of like a small couch.
It's a little odd. Minnie is portrayed as sort of this coquettish young woman, and Paul is sort of in a friar's outfit, I imagine,
with some sort of
St.
halo,
Paul, with a halo. And there's a love seat, as you say, in the middle, And labeled on the love seat is the name Minneapolis.
Fifth city, which is a little confusing because Stickney had said sixth city, so we don't know which one it would have been.
But we would have been big time.
Yeah. And there's actually 2 Bartholomew cartoons on here about merging these cities, both of which depict these Minneapolis and St. Paul in human form, and they're worth checking out on the story if you can take a look. Okay, so Stickney says you should do this, but that's not enough, right? I mean, I don't know. Like, we didn't merge, so I presume they didn't listen
didn't
to
go
them.
anywhere. It's interesting. There was actually a couple legislative bills introduced in the 20th century. In 1909, a bill passed the House to create a committee to drop a merger plan. Although there was a suggestion in the newspaper coverage that a lot of the legislators were sort of mocking the idea and sort of voted for it, chuckling. Okay. In any event, it didn't take root. It didn't go anywhere. And then as late as 1943, during World War II, there was a St. Paul legislator named John Drexler who introduced a bill to merge the 2 cities into quote-unquote twin city. Once local government officials and voters agreed, and I was unable to find any more talk of this particular bill in the newspapers, which tells me that it went nowhere.
Okay. So it's opinion time, Kevin. Do you think the city should have merged, or was it best that they did it the way they did?
I understand. I came to St. Paul in the 70s to go to St. Thomas, and I would hear about the fact that it wasn't long before that people in Minneapolis and St. Paul stayed on their side of the river and didn't cross over. But by the 70s, people were, in fact, crossing the bridge and taking advantage of the various amenities and attractions in both cities. I like the idea that there are 2 cities here. I think that makes us unique. Each city is different enough so that it makes it interesting. So I'm all for the 2-city concept. How about you, Eric?
I mean, I agree with that sentiment. I think, if you think about it generally, I think that the cultures and the history of the cities are very different. I mean, just thinking about even like the Skid Row demolitions and things that happened in Minneapolis that didn't quite happen in St. Paul. These cities really took different paths. As someone who came here not knowing very much about these cities and not knowing much about the Twin Cities, I feel like the Twin Cities gets like not enough attention because of this, because like they just don't make it on the lists, if you will, unfortunately, which is a really shallow way of looking at it. We shouldn't be, they should just do all these lists based on metro area and not by city. But unfortunately, that's just the way it goes.
Well, it's surprising to hear this from you, Eric. You're a native New Yorker.
Yeah, my city's number one.
And yet you've got a full-on Minnesota inferiority complex, and so you need to.
I hail from the number one on the list.
Here we go. Here we go.
But yeah, I know. I think it's very valid. The cities are very different, and so when you're here and you're steeped in it, you see why they didn't merge. I think when you're outside, I can sympathize with that Chicago newspaper editor who's like, look, just combine them already, or what have you, because from the outside in, it just seems like an obvious decision. And now we don't really talk about it anymore anyway, so it's not a live issue anymore, even though it was for how long? Half a century or more?
Yeah, and it's interesting if you look at the comments to the story online, and the story drew nearly 100 comments. There are a lot of people who think it might not be a bad idea, and they're talking mainly about the fact that having all these governments is a matter of duplication and extra expense, and think of the savings we could have if we had one city and one county. In which, by the way, when they're talking about one county for the one city, they would have named that Minnehaha.
Oh, okay, Minnehaha County. Right. All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Always good to be with you, Eric.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. If you've got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer, send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.